June 16th, 363 A.D. Somewhere south of Ctesiphon, near the heart of the Persian Empire, a Roman emperor named Julian stood on the banks of the Tigris River and gave an order that would doom his army. According to Ammianus Marcellinus, a soldier who watched in horror, Julian commanded his men to burn their fleet. 1,100 ships. The smoke blackened the sky for days. The soldiers wept. They understood what their emperor apparently did not. He had just destroyed their only way home. Think about those numbers. 65,000 Roman soldiers, 3 months' march deep into enemy territory, watching their supply line go up in flames. The eyewitness, Ammianus Marcellinus, recorded this moment in excruciating detail. The panic, the realization, the confession of Persian spies who had engineered the trap. Julian had won every battle. He stood outside the Persian capital, and he had just sealed his army's fate. By the end of this video, you'll understand how documented historical sources reveal one of Rome's greatest military disasters, a campaign where tactical brilliance met strategic catastrophe. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that will change how you see this campaign. First, the deception that convinced Julian to burn his fleet, recorded by the Romans who fell for it. Second, the environmental weapon the Persians used, heat, dust, and hunger, documented in soldiers' accounts. Third, the spear that killed Julian, and why historians still debate whose side threw it. But here's what makes this historically fascinating. How did a 31-year-old emperor who'd never lost a battle make the single worst decision in Roman military history? What tactical brilliance, documented in multiple sources, won him victory after victory, only for strategic hubris to destroy everything? Why did Persian King Shapur II, who could have crushed the Romans in battle, choose instead to let the desert do his killing? How does an army win every fight and still lose the war? To understand how Rome's last pagan emperor marched 65,000 men into Mesopotamia and came back in a coffin, we need to step back 9 months earlier, to a winter palace in Antioch, where Julian was planning to become the next Alexander the Great. Flavius Claudius Julianus was born around 331 AD in Constantinople, the sole survivor of a family massacre. When his uncle Constantine the Great died in 337, the Constantinian dynasty tore itself apart in a purge that killed almost every male relative Julian had. His father, Julius Constantius, was murdered. His brother Gallus would later be executed. Only Julian and his cousin Constantius II survived. The boy grew up knowing that being born into the imperial family was less a privilege than a death sentence. That childhood shaped everything Julian became. Historians analyzing his later writings identify what they call an Alexander complex, an obsession with the Macedonian conqueror that went beyond admiration into something close to religious belief. Julian convinced himself that his soul was linked to Alexander's, that he was destined to complete what Alexander had begun, the conquest of the East. He studied the campaigns obsessively. He read the histories. He believed, according to his own letters, that the gods themselves had chosen him to restore Rome's glory and prove that the old pagan religion was superior to the Christianity his family had embraced. By November 361, when his cousin Constantius died and left Julian sole emperor of Rome, he was 30 years old and carrying the weight of dynastic survival, religious zealotry, and military ambition. He'd proven himself in Gaul, defeating Germanic tribes at the Battle of Argentoratum in 357, securing the Rhine frontier through brilliant tactical warfare. But Gaul wasn't enough. Alexander had conquered Persia. Julian would do the same. The winter of 362 to 363, Julian spent in Antioch preparing for what he intended as Rome's greatest eastern campaign. Contemporary sources record that he arrived during the festival of Adonis, a mourning ritual for a dying god. The citizens interpreted it as a bad omen. Julian ignored them. He spent 9 months assembling an army, stockpiling supplies, and alienating Antioch's Christian population with his pagan sacrifices and his biting satire, the misopogon, mocking the city's customs. He didn't care about their approval. He cared about proving that the old gods favored him. Modern military historians examining Julian's strategic plan describe it as textbook Roman warfare, a pincer movement designed to trap the Persian capital between two converging armies. The main force of 65,000 to 83,000 men would advance down the Euphrates River, supported by a massive fleet of 1,100 ships carrying siege equipment, supplies, and months of provisions. Meanwhile, a northern detachment, sources disagree on the exact number, ranging from 18,000 to 30,000 soldiers, would march through Armenia and descend the Tigris River from the north. The two armies would converge on Ctesiphon, crushing Persian resistance between them. To add psychological warfare to military strategy, Julian brought with him Hormizd, the brother of Persian King Shapur II. Hormizd had lived in Roman protection for 40 years, since fleeing Persia as a young man. Julian's plan was regime change: defeat Shapur in battle, install Hormizd as a puppet king, and turn Persia into a Roman client state. Ammianus Marcellinus, who would march with the army, later described this plan as incomprehensible. A man exiled for 4 decades had no power base, no support, no realistic chance of holding the Persian throne. But Julian believed in destiny more than political reality. On March 5th, 363 AD, Julian left Antioch. He vowed never to return. He would keep that promise, but not the way he intended. To understand what Julian was marching into, you need to understand the man waiting for him. Shapur II had been king of kings of the Sasanian Persian Empire since the moment of his birth in 309 AD. Legend says the courtiers placed the crown on his mother's pregnant belly before he was even born. A story that emphasizes the Persian concept of divine kingship more than historical fact. What is documented is that Shapur ruled from infancy, guided by regents until he came of age at 16, and then reigned for 70 consecutive years, the longest reigning monarch in Iranian history. By 363, Shapur was 54 years old. He'd spent 26 of those years fighting Romans in a series of wars that had seesawed across Mesopotamia and Armenia. He'd captured the fortress city of Amida in 359 after a 73-day siege. Documented in Ammianus Marcellinus' own accounts, Ammianus had been there, had watched the city fall, had barely escaped with his life. Shapur knew Roman tactics. He'd defeated Roman armies before. And he understood something Julian apparently didn't, that in the Mesopotamian desert, patience defeats impetuosity. Contemporary Roman sources describe Shapur's physical presence on the battlefield. Ammianus Marcellinus recorded that mounted, Shapur surpassed all his companions in height, wearing a distinctive crown topped with a ram's head set with precious stones. In battle, he wore golden armor that caught the sun. He was called Dulak Taf by Arab chroniclers, #0, supposedly for the brutal practice of threading ropes through the shoulders of captives and marching them across the desert. Though modern historians debate whether this was literal truth or propaganda. What's beyond debate is Shapur's strategic mastery. Military historians analyzing his campaigns note that Shapur excelled at avoiding the kind of pitched battles where Roman legions had tactical superiority. He understood that Rome's greatest weakness was logistics. The further an army marched from its supply base, the more vulnerable it became. He'd watched previous Roman invasions exhaust themselves trying to take fortified Persian cities. He'd seen emperors retreat in frustration when their supply lines stretched too thin. Shapur didn't need to defeat Julian in glorious combat. He just needed to make the desert, the heat, and Roman hubris do the work for him. By March 363, Shapur had spent a quarter-century fighting Romans. He knew their strengths, he knew their weaknesses, and he was about to teach Julian the difference between winning battles and winning wars. The collision between these two men, the young philosopher king and the patient Persian monarch, began with an omen that everyone ignored. On March 5th, 363, Julian's army marched northeast from Antioch toward the Euphrates. At Hierapolis, modern Manbij, where the whole army mustered to cross the river, disaster struck. According to Ammianus Marcellinus' eyewitness account, a massive portico collapsed while soldiers were marching beneath it. 50 men were killed instantly, crushed under tons of stone and timber. Then, a huge haystack collapsed, smothering more soldiers. Near the camp, soldiers killed a gigantic lion. Neoplatonist seers debated the meaning. Did it symbolize the death of a king? Julian argued it meant Shapur's death. Others weren't so sure. The army that crossed the Euphrates was a hybrid force combining Julian's veteran Gallic legions with Eastern Roman troops more accustomed to desert warfare. Historical records document the composition, the Petulantes and Celtae, hardened warriors who'd fought Germanic tribes on the Rhine, now marching toward Iraqi heat they'd never experienced. The Scolae Palatinae, Imperial Guard cavalry units in gleaming armor. The Clibanarii, Roman heavy cavalry modeled on Persian cataphracts, riders and horses both armored in scale mail. And supporting them, 1,100 to 1,250 ships, sources vary slightly on the exact count, carrying 20,000 personnel and enough supplies to sustain the army for months. This fleet was the campaign's logistical backbone. Contemporary accounts describe 50 heavy warships for river security, 700 to 1,000 transport vessels loaded with siege engines, battering rams, artillery pieces, grain, water, and the disassembled components of massive siege towers. The fleet stretched for miles along the Euphrates, a floating city tethered to the army's advance. Without it, marching an army of 65,000 men through the Mesopotamian desert would be impossible. With it, Julian could penetrate deep into Persian territory, supplied and supported at every step. At Callinicum, where the army crossed the Euphrates on pontoon bridges, Julian made a gesture that committed his forces entirely to the campaign. Following the ancient military practice of eliminating retreat options, Julian reportedly had the bridge cut after his troops crossed. It was a calculated statement. No retreat, only victory or death. The soldiers understood the symbolism. They were marching into Persian territory with no fallback plan. Everything depended on the campaign's success. The army proceeded to Carrhae, modern Haran, a location heavy with historical irony. This was where Roman general Crassus had been defeated and killed by the Parthians in 53 BC, 3 centuries earlier. Standing on the same ground where Rome had suffered one of its worst military disasters, Julian divided his forces. The northern detachment, Ammianus, says 30,000 men, though other sources claim as few as 18,000, marched east under Procopius and Sebastianus to link up with Armenian King Arshak II and descend the Tigris from the north. The main army turned south, following the Euphrates deeper into Mesopotamia. The plan was brilliant. 2 armies converging on the Persian capital from opposite directions. Shapur would be trapped. Except Procopius never made it. and Julian never knew why. Julian's strategic deception was sophisticated. By sending a substantial force northeast toward the Tigris, he created the impression that Rome would invade via the northern route through Armenia, the traditional path previous Roman armies had taken, where a mountainous terrain favored heavy infantry over Persian cavalry. Meanwhile, his main force would actually strike from the west, advancing rapidly down the Euphrates before the Persians could redeploy. Strategically, it was classic Roman military doctrine: divide, deceive, and destroy. The northern detachment under Procopius had a dual mission. First, link up with Armenian King Arshak II, whose forces historians estimate at around 24,000 men. Second, create a credible threat that would force Shapur to divide his attention and resources. Third, if possible, descend the Tigris and coordinate with Julian's main army for a simultaneous assault on Ctesiphon from north and west. Contemporary sources make clear that Julian's entire strategy depended on timing and coordination. Both armies needed to arrive at the Persian capital in late May to trap Shapur's forces and overwhelm the city's defenses. But the plan had a fatal flaw that wouldn't become apparent until it was too late. Coordinating two separate armies across hundreds of miles of hostile terrain with no reliable communication between them required perfect execution and favorable circumstances. Procopius would have to navigate through Armenia, secure Armenian cooperation, march through difficult mountain passes, and arrive at exactly the right moment. Any delay, any miscalculation, any unexpected resistance would throw off the entire timeline. Julian was betting everything on synchronization he couldn't guarantee. To add regime change to military conquest, Julian brought Hormizd, or Misdas, to the Romans, Shapur's older brother, who had fled Persia 40 years earlier during a succession dispute. Ammianus Marcellinus, who knew Hormizd personally, notes his delicate position throughout the campaign. The plan was straightforward. After defeating Shapur in battle and capturing Ctesiphon, install Hormizd as a pro-Roman puppet king, ensuring Persia would never again threaten Rome's eastern frontier. Ammianus himself described the plan as incomprehensible. A man who'd been exiled for 4 decades, who had no remaining power base in Persia, who was viewed by Persians as a traitor living under Roman protection, had virtually no chance of holding the throne, even if Julian somehow managed to place him on it. The plan was perfect on paper. 2 converging armies, psychological warfare with Hormizd, strategic deception forcing Shapur to react defensively. Rome's best legions led by an emperor who'd never lost a battle. What could possibly go wrong? Everything. But Julian wouldn't know that until he was standing outside Ctesiphon in June, wondering why Procopius hadn't appeared, wondering why the northern army had failed to materialize, wondering why his perfect plan was falling apart. While Julian marched south expecting his cousin to appear from the north, he was entering a landscape that would become his army's graveyard. Entering Assyria, the environment shifted dramatically. The army left behind the Syrian semi-desert and entered the lush, complex terrain of the Mesopotamian alluvial plain. Ammianus Marcellinus, marching with the troops, described the landscape in detail. Crisscrossed by irrigation canals and dikes, lined with date palms, dotted with mud brick villages built on artificial mounds to avoid flooding. The humidity rose. Insects swarmed in clouds. The heat began building toward the summer temperatures that would later devastate the army. To guard against ambush in this maze of waterways and vegetation, Julian adopted a combat march formation. The baggage train and fleet remained in the center, protected by the river on one flank. Infantry formed defensive squares around them. 1,500 mounted scouts patrolled the desert flank, watching for Arab raiders or Persian cavalry. It was slow, cautious movement, but necessary in terrain where visibility was measured in yards, not miles. The first test came at Anatha, an island fortress in the middle of the Euphrates. Ammianus records that Julian used Hormizd for psychological warfare. The exiled prince approached the walls on a ship, shouting to the defenders that Shapur was doomed and that he, their rightful king, had returned. Initially, the garrison responded with insults and arrows. But as the Roman fleet appeared, 1,100 ships covering the river from bank to bank, the defenders' courage failed. The sight of that massive armada, stretching for miles, was overwhelming. The garrison surrendered. Julian accepted their capitulation, then burned the fortress to ashes. The message was clear: surrender and live, resist and die. The army pushed deeper into Mesopotamia. At Pirazabora, modern Peraz Shapur, they encountered serious resistance. The city was one of Persia's principal storehouses, heavily fortified with double walls of baked brick and bitumen, defended by a garrison Ammianus describes as men of iron in scale mail armor. The city's commander, Maiozamalcha, refused to surrender. Julian ordered a siege. Contemporary accounts document the Romans' engineering prowess. They constructed a helepolis, a massive siege tower covered in iron plates and wet animal hides to prevent fire arrows from igniting it. As this engine rose higher than the city's walls, the defenders watched in growing terror. A battering ram pounded the outer wall until a corner tower collapsed. The defenders retreated to the inner citadel. Realizing that the helepolis would breach that position as well, Maiozamalcha surrendered. Here, a critical moment revealed Julian's leadership style. After the victory, the soldiers demanded a massive donativum, a cash bonus from the plunder. They'd won a hard fight. They expected to be paid. Julian stood on a tribunal and delivered a speech that Ammianus recorded. He told them he possessed no personal wealth, that his treasure was his soul and their glory. He offered to abdicate if they wanted a steward rather than an emperor who shared their hardships. Shamed by his rhetoric and his obvious personal courage, the troops backed down, clashing their shields in approval. It was a moment that demonstrated why his soldiers followed him. Not for money, but for the intangible currency of shared sacrifice and mutual respect. 2 fortresses down, the fleet was working perfectly. The army was winning every fight. Julian was 11 miles from Ctesiphon, and he was about to make history, just not the way he planned. What happened at the next fortress would show the Romans at their tactical best, and it would be the last time anything went according to plan. Maiozamalcha stood 11 miles from Ctesiphon, close enough that smoke from its fires would be visible from the Persian capital's walls. The fortress was formidable. Walls too thick for conventional battering rams, a citadel perched on an artificial hill in the city center. The garrison knew Ctesiphon's survival depended on them holding out. They'd seen what happened to Anatha and Pirazabora. They understood the stakes. Julian ordered an approach that would become legendary in military engineering annals. Instead of assaulting the walls directly, Roman engineers began digging cuniculi, tunnels shored up with timber beams, advancing toward the fortress foundations. Ammianus Marcellinus provides technical details. The work was backbreaking. Teams of soldiers excavated in shifts, working in cramped darkness by lamplight. The tunnels were barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, supported every few feet with wooden props to prevent cave-ins. The air was stifling, thick with dust. To disguise the mining operation, Julian ordered constant artillery bombardment. Ballistae and onagers hurled stones and bolts at the walls, maintaining enough noise and activity to cover the sound of picks and shovels underground. The defenders focused on repelling the visible siege, while beneath their feet, Romans burrowed like moles. The breakthrough came without warning. Ammianus records the exact moment. Tunnelers broke through into the basement of a house in the city's center. Roman soldiers poured through the opening, emerging inside Maiozamalcha's walls like demons summoned from the earth. The defenders, focused on the walls and gates, suddenly found enemy troops behind them, inside their defenses. Panic spread. The Romans opened the gates from within. The assault force stormed through. What followed was a sack. The city was razed. The garrison commander, who had insulted Hormizd during negotiations, was executed. Soldiers looted gold, silver, silk, the accumulated wealth of a Persian frontier stronghold. But even as they celebrated, intelligence reports were arriving. Shapur II was finally moving. The great king's main army was approaching. The shadow Julian had been racing against was catching up. 3 fortresses taken, every engagement won. The Persian capital was 11 miles away. Julian's army was unstoppable, or so they thought. What they didn't know was that Shapur had been watching, and he was ready. On May 29th, 363, the Romans reached the walls of Ctesiphon. What they saw stopped them cold. The city sprawled across the east bank of the Tigris, protected by massive fortifications and the river itself. The Tigris in late May, swollen with spring meltwater from the mountains, was a natural moat hundreds of yards wide with a swift current and steep mud banks. On the opposite shore, a Persian army commanded by General Maranga, also called Pigranes in some sources, waited in full battle array. Cataphracts in their distinctive armor, tight formations of infantry. And behind them, war elephants, those exotic weapons that had terrified Roman armies for centuries. But before the army could even contemplate crossing the Tigris, they had to reach it. The challenge was the Nahar Malcha, the royal canal that connected the Euphrates and Tigris rivers. This ancient waterway, built centuries earlier, provided a direct route for the Roman fleet from one river to the other. The problem, according to Ammianus, was that the Persians had anticipated exactly this maneuver. They dammed and filled the canal's lower sections, blocking Roman passage. Julian ordered a massive engineering operation. Thousands of soldiers and captives were put to work dredging the channel, clearing obstructions, rebuilding the watercourse. It took days of backbreaking labor under the Iraqi sun. When the work was complete, they breached the dam. The waters of the Euphrates rushed through the reopened canal with tremendous force, creating a navigable channel. The fleet sailed across what had been desert, entering the Tigris upstream of Ctesiphon. It was a remarkable achievement of Roman engineering, and it brought the army to the Persian capital's doorstep. Now they faced the Tigris itself. Julian convened a council of war. His generals looked at the swollen river, the steep opposite bank, the waiting Persian army, and advised against crossing. The tactical situation was terrible. The Romans would have to row across under fire, scale muddy banks while being attacked, and form battle lines while partially surrounded. Every military principle suggested waiting, finding another approach, reconsidering the strategy. Julian ordered a night assault. He'd come too far to hesitate now. Under cover of darkness, Julian loaded his elite units, the Petulantes and other veteran legions, onto boats. They rowed silently across the turbulent river, oars muffled. But the Persians detected them. Fire arrows arched through the darkness, setting the lead boats ablaze. Men screamed as flames consumed wooden hulls. But enough Romans reached the far bank to scramble up the steep mud slopes and establish a foothold. Seeing the bridgehead in danger of being overrun, Julian ordered the entire fleet to cross immediately, creating a chaotic but overwhelming wave of Roman infantry hitting the east bank. The battle that followed demonstrated why Roman legions had conquered the Mediterranean world. The Persian cataphracts charged, their heavy cavalry meant to shatter infantry formations. But the Roman infantry, fighting in disciplined close order, held firm. The heavy pilum, the Roman javelin, proved devastatingly effective against armored horses. Wounded animals reared, threw riders, crashed into their own ranks. The elephants, brought forward as terror weapons, were met with fire and coordinated javelin volleys. The massive beasts panicked, trumpeting in pain and fear, and did exactly what elephants do when panicked in battle. They trampled anyone in their path, including their own troops. The Persian line shattered. They fled toward Ctesiphon's gates, the Romans pursuing. Contemporary sources, including the Christian historian Socrates Scholasticus, no friend to the pagan Julian, confirm the outcome. Ammianus Marcellinus records casualties at approximately 70 Romans killed versus 2,500 Persians. Zosimus gives slightly different numbers, 75 Roman dead, but confirms the catastrophic disparity, even accounting for possible exaggeration. This was a stunning tactical victory. The Romans chased the fleeing Persians to the very gates. General Victor was wounded trying to prevent soldiers from following the enemy into the city, fearing an ambush in Ctesiphon's labyrinthine streets. The gates slammed shut. The Romans had won the greatest tactical victory of the campaign, and it meant absolutely nothing, because what happened next would turn victory into catastrophe. Julian stood outside the Persian capital facing a strategic checkmate. Ctesiphon's walls remained intact. The city's garrison was unbroken, and Julian lacked the siege equipment necessary for a sustained assault. The heavy engines were still with the fleet, too cumbersome to deploy quickly. More critically, Procopius and the Northern Army had failed to appear. The pincer movement that was supposed to trap Ctesiphon between two Roman forces had collapsed. Julian had one army instead of two. Intelligence reports painted an even bleaker picture. Shapur II was approaching with his main army, forces far larger than the detachment Julian had just defeated. The great king had finally committed to battle, and he was bringing everything. Supplies inside the Roman camp were dwindling. The fleet could resupply them, but only if they stayed near the river. Retreating back down the Euphrates meant rowing and sailing upstream against the current and prevailing winds. A journey that would take months and leave them vulnerable to Persian harassment the entire way. On June 16th, 363, Julian convened a council of war. According to Ammianus Marcellinus, Julian proposed a radical change in strategy. Abandon the siege of Ctesiphon. Refuse to retreat down the Euphrates. Instead, march inland and north along the Tigris, toward the mountains of Corduene in modern Kurdistan. There, in more favorable terrain, the army could find supplies, link up with Procopius if he finally appeared, and force Shapur to fight a battle on ground of Roman choosing rather than Persian. But this plan required solving a terrible problem. The fleet couldn't sail upstream against the Tigris current, and Julian couldn't spare 20,000 men to guard 1,100 ships while marching into hostile territory. The fleet that had made the deep penetration into Persia possible had become a liability. It tied the army to the river. It required protection. It limited mobility. And mobility, Julian argued, was now essential for survival. Julian gave the order. Burn the fleet. Save 12 boats to be carried on wagons for bridging operations. Destroy everything else. Ammianus describes what happened next with the precision of an eyewitness who couldn't believe what he was seeing. 1,100 ships were set ablaze. The smoke rose in massive columns, darkening the sky. Soldiers watched their lifeline to home consumed by flames they'd been ordered to light. Many wept openly. They understood what their emperor apparently didn't. They were now stranded. No transport, no river mobility, no way back except on foot through enemy territory. Then the deception was revealed. During the burning, Persian deserters who had been advising Julian on the inland route were seized and tortured. Under interrogation, they confessed they were spies sent by Shapur specifically to lure Julian away from the river. The inland route wasn't salvation. It was a trap. Julian tried desperately to countermand his order, to save some of the fleet. But the fire had spread too far. The ships were consumed. Historians debate whether burning the fleet was tactical necessity or catastrophic error. Modern military analysts offer conflicting assessments. Some argue Julian had no good options. Staying meant being trapped against Ctesiphone's walls when Shapur arrived with overwhelming force. Others point out that he'd fallen for a classic deception, destroyed his strategic mobility, and eliminated any possibility of organized retreat. The scholarly consensus leans heavily toward the latter view. Whatever Julian's reasoning, the result was undeniable. As the smoke rose and the ships burned, 65,000 Roman soldiers understood they weren't marching to victory. They were marching to their deaths, and the Persians were waiting. What Shapur II did next wasn't military genius in the conventional sense. It was environmental murder. He didn't need to fight the Romans in pitched battle. He just needed to let Mesopotamia kill them. The strategy he employed had been refined over centuries of warfare in the region. Scorched earth combined with constant harassment, turning geography and climate into weapons more deadly than swords. Ammianus Marcellinus describes the horror in detail. Ahead of the Roman advance, Persian cavalry torched crops. Granaries were emptied and burned. Wells were poisoned or filled with stones and earth. Irrigation canals were breached, flooding roads with brackish water unsuitable for drinking. The Romans marched through a blackened wasteland of ash and ruin, finding nothing to sustain them. Every village they approached had been stripped bare or destroyed. Every source of food had been eliminated. Every water source had been contaminated. The heat intensified as June progressed. Mesopotamia in summer is brutal even for those acclimated to it. For Roman soldiers from Gaul, accustomed to the Rhine's cool forests, the heat was devastating. Contemporary accounts document temperatures that modern analysis suggests exceeded 40 degrees Celsius, over 104 Fahrenheit. Men died of heat stroke in their armor. The dust kicked up by 65,000 marching soldiers created choking clouds that reduced visibility to yards. And then there were the insects. Ammianus describes swarms of flies and gnats that blotted out the sun. The language isn't hyperbole. Anyone who's experienced a true insect plague in a river valley understands. Millions upon millions of flying insects, attracted by sweat and blood, crawling into eyes and mouths, making rest impossible, driving horses and men to near madness. Soldiers developed what modern analysts would recognize as symptoms of severe exhaustion and psychological trauma. The inability to sleep, constant hypervigilance, the numbed, 1,000-yard stare of men pushed beyond normal human endurance. The Persians never gave them rest. Light cavalry appeared without warning, loosed volleys of arrows, and vanished before the Romans could respond. Stragglers were cut down. Foraging parties were ambushed. Water-gathering details were attacked. The harassment was constant, methodical, designed not to win battles, but to grind down morale and drain strength through attrition. Sleep became impossible. The army marched in a defensive square, baggage in the center, infantry on all sides. But the formation was cumbersome and slow. Persian hit-and-run tactics turned the march into a grinding ordeal. Modern military historians analyzing Shapur's strategy note its perfection. He avoided the kind of pitched battle where Roman tactical discipline and heavy infantry gave them the advantage. Instead, he fought them with patience, geography, and environmental warfare. The scorched earth denied them sustenance. The heat sapped their strength. The insects prevented rest. The constant raids maintained psychological pressure. And all the while, Shapur's main army shadowed them, never committing to full engagement, just waiting for exhaustion and starvation to do what swords and arrows couldn't. By late June, the Romans weren't an army anymore. They were a mob of starving, heat-exhausted men stumbling north, hoping to find water, food, anything. The Persians didn't need to destroy them. Mesopotamia was doing it for them. But Shapur wasn't finished. He was about to force one final battle. 4 days after the longest day of the year, as the Roman column approached a place called Maranga, the Persians finally attacked in force. Shapur II had decided the moment was right. The Romans were exhausted. Their supplies were nearly gone. Disease was spreading through the ranks. If he could destroy them here, the campaign would end without having to risk his capital. The Persian force that assembled at Maranga was formidable. Ammianus Marcellinus identifies the commander as Marini, whom he calls the commander of cavalry, accompanied by 2 of Shapur's sons, a sign of how seriously the great king took this battle. The Persians deployed their full arsenal. Cataphracts formed the heavy cavalry corps. Mounted archers provided mobile firepower. War elephants anchored the line. It was everything Persia could bring to bear against an exhausted Roman army. Julian, seeing the Persian deployment, formed his army into a crescent shape, a classic anti-cavalry formation designed to prevent encirclement. The wings extended forward, threatening to envelop any force that committed to the center. It was sound tactics from an emperor who, despite his strategic errors, remained tactically brilliant. The battle began with Persian archers raining volleys on the Roman formation. Ammianus describes the Romans forming testudo, the famous tortoise formation where shields locked overhead and on all sides, creating a mobile wall that could advance under arrow fire. The elephant charge came next. The massive beasts trumpeted forward, their sheer size and exotic nature designed to break infantry morale. But the Romans had fought elephants before. Veterans knew the tactics. Target the mahouts, the riders controlling the animals. Use javelins and axes to wound the elephants' legs and trunks. Create enough pain and confusion to make the animals uncontrollable. It worked. Wounded elephants reared, turned, trampled their own troops in their panic. The battle lasted most of the day. When it ended, the Persians withdrew to their camp in good order. Ammianus claims Persian losses were more significant than Roman casualties, though he provides no specific numbers for either side. The Romans held the field, technically a victory, but strategically, it changed nothing. The army was still trapped. Supplies were still exhausted. Disease was still spreading. After a 3-day truce, the Roman column resumed its desperate march north. The soldiers had won. It didn't matter. The army was a spent force stumbling through enemy territory, hoping against hope to reach safety before starvation or disease, or the next Persian attack finished them. 4 days later, everything would end. On June 26th, 363, the Roman army resumed its march north. The heat was unbearable. Ammianus Marcellinus records that the temperature had already impelled Julian to remove his helmet and armor, a fatal decision driven by either the oppressive heat or his eagerness to scout ahead. The emperor rode at the front of the column, unprotected, visible to his troops but vulnerable in ways he'd never been before. The attack came in 3 coordinated waves. First, reports arrived that the rear guard was under assault. Julian galloped back to rally the troops, responding to the threat. Before he could reach them, warning came from the vanguard. The front of the column was also under attack. Julian turned his horse again. Then the left flank erupted in chaos. A charge of elephants and heavy Persian cavalry hit the Roman line. The formation began to buckle. Seeing the left wing in danger of collapse, Julian did what he'd always done. He charged into the melee, shouting encouragement, waving his arms, leading from the front in a display of personal courage that had won him loyalty in Gaul and throughout his career. It was heroic. It was reckless. And in the confusion of dust and combat, it was fatal. In the chaos, a cavalry spear was thrown. Ammianus Marcellinus, who was there, admits he doesn't know who threw it. The spear grazed Julian's arm, fractured a rib, and pierced his liver. The emperor, in a reflex born of pain and desperation, tried to pull the spear out by grasping the blade. The sharp edge severed tendons in his fingers. He fell from his horse. The mystery of who killed Julian has intrigued historians for 17 centuries. Ammianus explicitly states that no one knows the spear's origin. Several theories emerged almost immediately. The first, and most likely, according to Julian's personal physician Euphrates, was that a Lakhmid Arab auxiliary fighting for the Persians threw it, a random act in the fog of war. The second theory, first suggested by the pagan rhetorician Libanius and later embraced by Christian sources, was assassination by a disaffected Christian soldier in Julian's own army, taking revenge for the emperor's persecution of their faith. The third is pure legend, the spear of St. Mercurius, a Christian story that the martyr threw a divinely guided spear from heaven. Modern historical consensus strongly favors the first explanation. There's no contemporary evidence for Christian assassination. No Persian reward was ever claimed. No deathbed accusation was made. Most likely, it was a random battlefield casualty, a spear thrown in the confusion of combat, finding a target by chance rather than design. The ultimate irony of Julian's death is its meaninglessness. No epic duel, no dramatic last stand, just chaos, dust, and a spear that happened to find the one man in the Roman army not wearing armor. Julian was carried to his tent. The scene Ammianus describes is remarkably detailed. The emperor didn't weep. He didn't rage against fate. Instead, he engaged his companions, the philosophers Priscus and Maximus, in a final discussion about the nature of the soul. He viewed death as a liberation of the spirit from the body, a return to the eternal realm of ideas. It was thoroughly consistent with his Neoplatonist beliefs. He refused to name a successor, saying he didn't wish to doom a friend to such a dire situation. He asked for a drink of cold water. After drinking, he died quietly around midnight. He was 31 years old. He'd ruled as sole emperor for 1 year and 8 months. Julian died as he lived, discussing philosophy, refusing compromise, believing until the end that the gods favored him. He was wrong, and 65,000 Roman soldiers were about to pay the price for his error. Because when dawn came on June 27th, they faced a problem worse than a battle. They had no emperor, They had no plan, and they were still trapped in Persia. By sunrise on June 27, 363, the generals assembled an emergency council. The army needed an emperor. Without one, command structure collapsed. Military law required someone to give orders, make decisions, negotiate with enemies. The situation was desperate. 50,000 exhausted soldiers surrounded by Persians, 300 miles deep in enemy territory. Supplies nearly gone, morale shattered. The first choice was obvious. Sallustius Secundus, the Praetorian prefect, was offered the purple. He was respected, experienced, competent. Ammianus records that Sallustius refused, citing his age and failing health. The official explanation sounded reasonable. The real reason was probably political wisdom. Taking the throne in this situation meant inheriting a military disaster with no good options. Success was unlikely. Survival was questionable. Sallustius was smart enough to decline the poisoned chalice. With Sallustius's refusal, the council faced an impasse. The Gallic officers wanted someone loyal to Julian's memory. The Eastern officers, who'd served under Constantius II, had different loyalties. Neither faction could agree on a candidate. In the confusion, someone, Ammianus doesn't record who, began shouting the name of Jovian, Flavius Jovianus, the Primicerius Domesticorum, commander of the Imperial Guard. He was a compromise candidate, a moderate Christian, which pleased the Eastern officers. Undistinguished enough not to threaten anyone, liked well enough by the troops. Above all, he was there, available, and acceptable to enough factions to avoid immediate civil war. The soldiers began acclaiming him. Jovianus Augustus, Jovianus Augustus. The cry spread through the camp, but on the edges, where the shout had traveled farthest and clarity had degraded, soldiers heard something different. They heard Julianus Augustus. They thought Julian had recovered. They thought their emperor still lived. Cheers erupted. Men who'd been in despair moments before suddenly had hope. Then Jovian appeared. Tall, blonde, clearly not Julian. The moment Ammianus describes is almost unbearably poignant. The cheers turned to wails of despair. The soldiers realized their emperor was truly dead. The man standing before them wasn't the philosophical warrior king who'd led them from Gaul to the gates of Ctesiphon. He was a compromise. An acceptable mediocrity chosen because no one could agree on anyone better. Jovian didn't want to be emperor. He'd inherited a nightmare. An army of 50,000 starving men surrounded by Persians, 300 miles deep in enemy territory, with no clear route home. His first decision as emperor was simple and terrible. Get them home alive, whatever it cost. The army resumed its march north, and the man who would collect the payment for their survival was waiting. Jovian's retreat turned into a slow-motion catastrophe. The army stumbled north along the Tigris, the Persians shadowing every step, cutting off stragglers, preventing foraging, maintaining constant pressure. The fog of war that had confused earlier battles was replaced by the terrible clarity of starvation. Soldiers knew exactly what was happening. They were dying by degrees: hunger, disease, exhaustion, dehydration. The only question was whether they'd die here or make it to Roman territory first. At Dura, on the banks of the Tigris, the army halted. They were trapped. Shapur II knew he could simply wait. Starvation would do his work within days. But a cornered Roman army, even one as weakened as this, was still dangerous. Desperate men fight with nothing to lose. Better to offer terms, get them out of Persian territory, and claim a diplomatic victory rather than risk a final, costly battle. Shapur sent envoys. He was willing to negotiate. The treaty signed at Dura in July 363 stands as one of the most humiliating agreements in Roman history. Multiple contemporary sources, Ammianus Marcellinus, Festus, Euphrates, document the terms. Rome ceded 5 trans-Tigritane provinces that had been Roman territory since the Treaty of 298, 65 years earlier. The provinces of Ar-Zenin, Maxoin, Zabdakin, Rehimin, and Corduane passed to Persian control. Rome surrendered the fortress cities of Nisibis and Singara, along with approximately 15 other fortified positions. Rome renounced its alliance with Armenia, effectively abandoning King Arshak II to Persian vengeance. In return, Shapur granted the Romans safe passage home and agreed to a 30-year truce. Modern historians analyzing the treaty use stark language. David Potter calls it a strategic catastrophe. Dodgen and Liu describe it as the most significant Roman territorial loss in the East since the Battle of Carrhae 3 centuries earlier. The territories surrendered represented 2 decades of Roman military gains, wiped out in a single treaty. Nisibis, which had withstood 3 separate sieges by Shapur in 338, 346, and 350, the greatest fortress of the Roman East, was simply handed over without a fight. The consequences rippled outward. Armenia's King Arshak II, left without Roman support, tried to resist Persian pressure. In 368, Shapur captured him. Arshak committed suicide in Persian captivity in 369 or 370, rather than face whatever fate Shapur had planned. Armenia was eventually partitioned between Rome and Persia in 387, its independence extinguished. The alliance structure Rome had built to contain Persian expansion collapsed. Shapur celebrated his triumph with rock reliefs carved at Bishapur, showing scenes of Roman submission. Some scholars believe one relief depicts Julian's body under the hooves of Shapur's horse, with Emperor Jovian kneeling in supplication. Whether the identification is correct or not, the symbolism was clear. Persia had achieved what no Persian king had managed since Shapur I captured Emperor Valerian a century earlier, the complete humiliation of Rome. In a single treaty, Rome surrendered more eastern territory than it had lost in the previous century. Shapur II had achieved strategic victory without winning a single major battle. He'd simply waited for the desert and Roman hubris to do the work. But the most dramatic moment of the disaster didn't happen at the treaty table. It happened at the gates of Nisibis, when Roman citizens learned their emperor had surrendered the impregnable. Nisibis had stood as the shield of the Roman East for generations. Modern Nusaybin, on the Turkish-Syrian border, the fortress had withstood 3 major sieges by Shapur II. In 338, 346, and 350, Persian armies had thrown themselves against Nisibis's walls and been repulsed. The city had never been taken by assault. Its fortifications were legendary. Its garrison was elite. Its citizens had endured months of bombardment, mining, and assault without breaking. Nisibis was unconquerable, or so everyone believed. When Jovian's orders arrived commanding the evacuation of Nisibis as required by the treaty, the citizens refused to believe it. Ammianus Marcellinus records their initial response. They thought it was a test, a trick, an impossibility. No Roman emperor would surrender a city that had never fallen, the walls that had defied 3 sieges, the fortress that had become synonymous with Roman resistance in the East. It was inconceivable. But the orders were real. Roman soldiers, following imperial commands, began forcing the civilian population out. Families who'd lived in Nisibis for generations were driven from their homes at sword point by their own army. The scenes Ammianus describes are heartbreaking. Citizens wept. They cursed Jovian. They begged to be allowed to stay, to defend their city one more time. Some offered to fight to the death rather than see Nisibis surrendered. It didn't matter. The treaty was signed. The city had to be evacuated. As the long columns of refugees trudged away from Nisibis, they looked back. Contemporary accounts emphasize this detail. They looked back at their city, at the walls they'd helped defend, at the homes where their families had lived. And above those walls, the Persian standard rose where the Roman eagle had flown. The moment, historians note, marked something more than a military defeat. It was the definitive end of Roman dominance in the region. Not achieved through conquest, but through a treaty signed by an emperor who had no choice. Shapur II, according to later Persian sources preserved by Tabari, repopulated Nisibis with people from Istakhr and Spahan, Persian cities far from the frontier. He wanted loyal subjects, not a potentially rebellious Roman population waiting for reconquest. The great fortress of the East became a Persian city. The transformation was complete. The citizens of Nisibis looked back at their city as they were forced into exile, the walls they'd defended for decades, the homes where their families had lived for generations, and above it all, the Persian standard, flying where the Roman eagle had been. It was, as one historian wrote, the moment Rome lost the East, not in battle, not through conquest, but through a treaty signed by an emperor who had no choice. The army that limped back to Roman territory in August 363 had lost approximately a third of its men. They'd won every major battle. They'd burned their own fleet. They'd watched their emperor die. And they'd surrendered Rome's greatest fortress without a fight. The question historians have asked ever since is simple. How did this happen? Modern military historians analyzing Julian's Persian campaign identify 4 fatal flaws, each compounding the others until disaster became inevitable. First, logistical hubris. Julian's destruction of the fleet removed his margin for error. He bet everything on either a quick link-up with Procopius or a collapse of Persian will. Neither happened. Once the fleet was gone, the army had no strategic mobility, no resupply capacity, no fallback option. Every decision after June 16th was made from a position of weakness. Second, the Alexander complex. Modern scholars analyzing Julian's writings and decisions identify an ideological blindness born of his obsession with imitating Alexander the Great. When the siege of Ctesiphon proved impossible, rational strategy dictated retreat. Preserve the army, secure the territorial gains already achieved, return to try again with better preparation. But Julian refused to retreat. Alexander had conquered Persia. Julian would do the same. He chose to march deeper into the trap rather than admit the campaign had failed. His romanticism overruled his tactical competence. Third, intelligence failure. The northern pincer under Procopius never synchronized with the main army. Whether this was due to treachery, incompetence, or enemy action remains unclear. The historical record is silent on why Procopius failed to arrive. What's certain is that Julian's entire strategy depended on coordination he couldn't guarantee and communication he couldn't maintain. When Procopius didn't appear, the plan collapsed. Julian was left with one army instead of 2, facing a Persian capital he couldn't take and a Persian king he couldn't avoid. Fourth, underestimating the opponent. Shapur II's defensive mastery was perfect. He avoided the kind of pitched battles where Roman tactical discipline gave them the advantage. Instead, he fought with geography, hunger, and heat. The scorched earth denied sustenance. The constant harassment prevented rest. The desert became the weapon. And Shapur simply waited for environment and exhaustion to do what his cavalry couldn't. Modern military analysts comparing the campaign to other failed invasions, Napoleon in Russia, more recent campaigns in Afghanistan, note the same pattern. Superior tactical force defeated by strategic patience and environmental warfare. Scholars debate whether Julian could have won if circumstances had been different. If Procopius had arrived at Ctesiphon, could the combined armies have taken the city? Probably not. Even with both forces, sustaining a siege that deep in Persia while Shapur's main army approached was logistically near impossible. If Julian hadn't burned the fleet, could he have retreated successfully? Almost certainly. The Euphrates provided a secure route back to Syria. If Julian had survived the battle at Samarra, could he have negotiated better terms? Possibly. An emperor had more diplomatic weight than a general, and Julian's reputation might have secured less humiliating conditions. But the fundamental problem remained unsolvable. A Roman army couldn't sustain operations that deep in Persian territory. The logistics didn't work. The supply lines were too long. The environment was too hostile. The opponent was too patient. Julian's campaign was doomed once Ctesiphon didn't fall quickly and Procopius failed to appear. Everything after that was just the slow unfolding of inevitable defeat. Military academies today study Julian's Persian campaign not because of the battles he won, but because of the war he lost. It's a case study in how tactical brilliance means nothing without strategic wisdom. How the best army in the world can be defeated by patience, geography, and an opponent who understands that the desert fights for whoever knows it best. Shapur II knew. Julian didn't, and 65,000 men paid the price. The disaster's consequences went far beyond one failed campaign. What happened in those 4 months in 363 changed the Roman Empire permanently. The immediate territorial loss was staggering. 20% of the eastern frontier gone. 5 provinces that had been Roman for 65 years ceded. 15 fortified positions surrendered. Nisibis, the shield of the east, in Persian hands. Historical records confirm these territories were never recovered. They remained Persian until the Arab conquests of the 700s and 800s, nearly 3 centuries later. The strategic shift was equally profound. Never again did Rome mount a major offensive into Persia. The imperial frontier, which had been gradually pushing eastward for decades, suddenly contracted. Rome went from offensive to defensive posture. The stalemate that developed after 363 lasted until the 7th century, when Islamic expansion destroyed both empires. Historians analyzing the long-term military balance note that Julian's defeat ended Roman dreams of Eastern conquest. The best Rome could hope for after 363 was holding what remained. The religious consequences were immediate and lasting. Julian's death ended the last serious attempt to restore paganism. Christianity's position, already strong, became unchallengeable. The theological narrative was simple and devastating. God had punished the apostate. Julian had tried to prove the old god's favor through military victory. Instead, he'd achieved spectacular disaster and died on a Persian battlefield. Jovian, a Christian, immediately restored Christian privileges Julian had removed. The pagan counter-revolution died with its champion. Armenia's fate demonstrated the cascading consequences of strategic failure. King Arshak II, abandoned by Rome, tried to resist Persian pressure alone. In 368, 5 years after the treaty, Shapur captured him. Arshak committed suicide in Persian captivity rather than face execution or worse. Armenia was eventually partitioned between Rome and Persia in 387, its independence extinguished. The Christian Armenian Church, cut off from direct Roman support, aligned more closely with Persian power politics while maintaining theological independence from Chalcedonian Rome. The alliance structure Rome had built to contain Persia collapsed. Military doctrine shifted based on lessons learned in blood and failure. The campaign demonstrated limits of tactical superiority against strategic patience. Scorched earth tactics, proven effective even against the best armies, became standard defensive doctrine for weaker powers facing stronger invaders. The principle that logistics defeats strategy became gospel in military thinking. And the warning about underestimating opponents who fight asymmetrically rather than conventionally echoed through military history. The cultural impact created competing legacies. Christian sources, Socrates, Scholasticus, Sozomen, the Syriac Julian romance, portrayed Julian as a villain punished by divine justice. Pagan sources, Libanius, Euphrates, presented him as a tragic hero, a philosopher king destroyed by fate and circumstance. Modern historians, synthesizing both traditions with critical analysis, see him as neither villain nor hero, but as a brilliant, fatally flawed leader whose ideological obsessions overruled his tactical competence. The Treaty of 363 drew a line across the map of the Roman East. That line stayed there until Arabs conquered both Rome and Persia in the 7th century. Julian had marched into Mesopotamia planning to redraw the map in Rome's favor. Instead, he'd redrawn it in Persia's, and Rome spent the next 3 centuries living with the consequences. But perhaps the most lasting consequence wasn't territorial or strategic. It was the question that haunts military history. How does an emperor this brilliant make a mistake this catastrophic? The answer lies in understanding how intelligence and wisdom aren't the same thing. How tactical genius and strategic judgment require different kinds of thinking. How personal obsessions can blind even the most capable leaders to reality. Historical memory split along religious lines that persist in scholarship today. Christian sources portrayed Julian as divine punishment incarnate, the emperor who rejected God and was destroyed for his apostasy. The emphasis in these accounts is theological. Julian's military errors become evidence of divine disfavor. His death becomes judgment. The campaign's failure becomes proof that Christianity's triumph was inevitable and divinely ordained. This interpretation dominated European historical thinking for a millennium. Pagan sources took the opposite view. Libanius's funeral oration and Eunapius's history present Julian as a tragic hero in the classical mold. A brilliant, virtuous man destroyed by circumstances beyond his control and the machinations of unworthy subordinates. These accounts emphasize Julian's intellectual achievements, his military victories in Gaul, his personal courage. The Persian disaster becomes fate's cruel reversal rather than the natural consequence of poor judgment. This interpretation found renewed popularity in Enlightenment-era scholarship skeptical of Christian triumphalism. Modern historians, with access to both traditions plus archaeological evidence and comparative military analysis, construct a more nuanced picture. Julian was undeniably brilliant, intellectual, tactically gifted, personally brave. But his brilliance was undermined by ideological obsession. The Alexander complex, the need to prove pagan gods' superiority through military conquest, the refusal to accept that some strategic situations have no good tactical solutions. These weren't accidents of personality. They were fundamental to who Julian was. His greatest strengths and his fatal flaws came from the same source. The literary legacy extends beyond historical accounts. Ammianus Marcellinus's Res Gestae became the canonical source, studied by every subsequent generation of historians. Gore Vidal's novel Julian, published in 1964, revived popular interest in the last pagan emperor. Modern military academies use the campaign as a case study in logistics, strategic planning, and the dangers of overconfidence. The story resonates because it's fundamentally human. Ambition meeting reality, brilliance meeting limitation, dreams meeting disaster. The enduring questions remain unanswered because the evidence doesn't exist to answer them definitively. Could Julian have won if Procopius had arrived? Historians debate. Would different tactical decisions at critical moments have changed the outcome? Possibly. Was burning the fleet strategic necessity or fatal error? Scholars disagree. Who really killed Julian? We'll never know with certainty. These uncertainties keep the campaign alive in historical discourse. Every generation of scholars re-examines the evidence, applies new analytical frameworks, reaches slightly different conclusions. What's beyond debate is why the campaign matters. It marks the last major Roman offensive into Persia. It ends the possibility of pagan restoration. It demonstrates that strategic patience defeats tactical brilliance. When geography and logistics favor the defender, it shows how hubris, the ancient Greek concept of pride leading to destruction, remains a timeless military danger. Superior force, better training, tactical victories. None of it matters if strategic judgment fails. Julian's Persian campaign ended on a battlefield south of Samarra, with a spear no one can identify, thrown by someone history doesn't record. But the campaign's meaning is clear. It's the story of how ambition without wisdom leads to catastrophe, how tactical brilliance without strategic patience leads to defeat, how the best army in the world can lose to an opponent who understands that wars aren't won by winning battles. They're won by making your enemy destroy himself. Shapur II understood that. Julian the Apostate didn't. And the Roman Empire paid the price for the next 3 centuries. If you've made it this far, you've followed one of history's greatest military disasters from beginning to end. From an emperor's dream of becoming the next Alexander the Great, through tactical victories that meant nothing, to a spear in the desert that changed everything. You've seen how 65,000 Roman soldiers marched into Mesopotamia expecting glory and came back having lost an empire. According to Ammianus Marcellinus, the eyewitness who watched it all unfold, Julian's campaign should never have happened. The omens were clear. The risks were obvious. But Julian believed in destiny, in the favor of the gods, in his own brilliance. He was right about his brilliance. He was wrong about everything else. The Persian expedition of 363 matters because it's not just Roman history. It's human history. It's the story of how intelligence without wisdom leads to catastrophe. How tactical genius without strategic patience leads to defeat. How the strongest force in the world can be beaten by an opponent who refuses to fight on your terms. Shapur II didn't need to defeat Roman legions in pitched battle. He just needed to let the desert, the heat, and Roman hubris do the work. That lesson appears again and again in military history. From Napoleon in Russia to modern campaigns in the Middle East, the pattern repeats. The invader has superior force. The defender has superior patience. Geography becomes the weapon. And the invader, no matter how brilliant tactically, eventually starves, exhausts, and collapses. If this story resonated with you, if you appreciate deep historical research, verified sources, and the real human drama behind ancient battles, consider what surprised you most. Was it the burning of the fleet? The environmental warfare? The mystery of who killed Julian? The consequences that lasted 3 centuries? History this complex deserves engagement. It deserves questions. It deserves the recognition that 1700 years later, we're still learning lessons from Julian's mistakes. Here's a question worth considering. If you were Julian's advisor in June 363, standing outside Ctesiphon after the fleet burned, what would you have told him to do? Knowing what you know now about Shapur's strategy, about the heat, about the scorched earth, would you have counseled marching north into the trap? Or would you have found another way? There probably wasn't a good answer. That's what makes tragedy tragic. Julian made the best decision he could with the information he had. It destroyed his army, ended his life, and cost Rome the East. But it wasn't stupidity. It was hubris meeting reality, and reality always wins. On June 26th, 363, in the desert south of Samarra, a spear ended the reign of Rome's last pagan emperor. It also ended Rome's dream of conquering the East. The Persian Empire would stand for another 3 centuries. Christianity would become unchallengeable, and military historians would study Julian's campaign for the next 1700 years as a perfect example of how to lose a war you were winning. That's legacy. That's history. And that's why, nearly 2,000 years later, we're still telling the story of the emperor who burned his fleet and lost an empire.